Good morning. Listen to the Word of God from Luke's Gospel, chapter 18. And then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. And in that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Although I have no fear of God, nor respect for anyone, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And God said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to the chosen ones who cry out day and night? Will God delay long in helping them? I tell you, God will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of the human being comes, will he find faith on the earth?" This is the word of God. It's really interesting and instructive to notice how often Jesus chooses to hold up a despised person as a role model for his listeners. The Good Samaritan, the grateful leper, the beggar who could not be silenced, the Samaritan woman at the well, the prostituted woman who crashed the posh party and humbly sought the blessing from Jesus, the insane woman who we know now as Mary Magdalene, and the list goes on. In this way, Jesus manages to feed two birds with one scone. Thank you. Why would you want to kill two birds? First of all, he makes his teachings about faith in a very strong way, a memorable way. And on the other hand, at the same time, he reminds us that we are all God's precious children, and that God chooses to speak to us through whomever she chooses, whenever she chooses, wherever, however she chooses, and it's often a shocking surprise. The woman in this story is another in that long list. Perhaps the story was based on something Jesus had actually observed, or perhaps it grew from something that was told to him by one of his disciples, for there were many women among his disciples. There were not only the 12. And we note that both Old and New Testaments over and over cite widows and orphans as some of the most needy and oppressed people, because in that time, a woman without a man was vulnerable, basically powerless, and almost certainly poor. There were few ways that a woman could earn a living, driving many of them to the streets either to beg or to rent out their bodies, simply to gain survival for themselves and their children. And a woman's word in a court of law was worthless unless it was substantiated by a man. Well, in this story, here is one of those voiceless, powerless, useless beings daring to give voice day after day in the pursuit of simple justice. Somebody had taken advantage of her widowhood. Perhaps they had taken advantage even of her fresh grief. It still happens. And she was not going to be denied her day in court, even though she really didn't have a day in court. I love this woman. She refused to stay in her place. You could spin a story about her, and it's fun to do that. Imagine the bailiffs dragging her and tossing her outside of the court. And she hung out day after day, maybe week after week or month after month, we don't know, for a long time. She hung out after court was over, and she followed this unjust judge through the streets, making a fuss. Shame, shame, shame. I love this woman. She probably was hauled away again, maybe a lot of times. And then we can just imagine her coming with her children around her and conducting a sit-in on the front steps of the judge's house, maybe carrying a big sign, unjust, unworthy, impeach him. Can't you just imagine? He gave in to shut her up. She won. You do what you must in the pursuit of justice. She shows us the power of persistence in the pursuit of justice. So I want to tell some stories about more contemporary people who are kind of our idea now, who show us what it means to be an importunate one. I love that. How often do you get to say importunate? It's a wonderful word. Back in the 50s, at the beginning of the contemporary women's movement, Flo Kennedy, you know Flo Kennedy? Raise your hand if you know about Flo Kennedy. Oh, good, some people do. Flo Kennedy was an African-American woman, an attorney, and a leader in the women's movement. And Flo observed, most women are one man away from welfare. Well, that is still true for far too many in our country, especially women of color, widows, and older women. Today, an assault is being waged on the Social Security system, seeking to raise the age of eligibility, seeking to lower the cost of living adjustments, or even to totally destroy this vital safety net. And by the way, do you know that FDR gets credit for establishing Social Security, but Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor, this was actually her brainchild. We probably weren't taught that in school. Okay, come back to today. Women and men who have worked hard all their lives to support themselves and their families in jobs such as laborers, waitresses, hotel maids, childcare workers, cooks, they cannot push their bodies any farther into old age. They may have many physical problems from the hard labor and the many hours on their feet. They need to retire, and they must receive the return on the money they invested in Social Security. Many of them also have worked at low-wage jobs, allowing for small, if any, savings, and typically with no pension. Overwhelmingly, they are old, and overwhelmingly, they are women of color. We have the privilege. We can magnify their voices to see that they receive just simple justice, what they are owed, because our society could not function without their work. And so sometime today, when you go home, sit down at your computer and take a moment to breathe a prayer of thanks that you have a home and a computer and that you actually know how to use the computer. And then bring up the website, Strengthen Social Security. Doing so is a continuation of our worship, a matter of simple justice, a way of finding how we can become a voice for these who are so voiceless. It doesn't require a lot of time or trouble from us. It probably doesn't even require us to go out and march in the street. But like most struggles for justice, it does require that we adopt the importunate widow as our role model and persist. So let's go back to the beginning of today's lesson. Jesus told them a story about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. Pray always? How is this possible? Pray always. That prayer which is simply an ongoing conversation of the heart with the Holy One, who is the heart of all creation. Pray always. Be in the spirit of prayer. The Buddhists call this mindfulness. See without naming. Really see that gorgeous moon that we have been viewing at night. The faces all around you. The vegetables, colorful and beautifully displayed in the market or in your kitchen. Pray always. Really see with your whole being. There is a chant that Victor Floyd taught years ago, and I hope he will teach it here. I am one with the heart of creation. I am one with the heart of love. Well, I have not reached that place of oneness, but chanting it aloud or silently reminds me to be prayerfully mindful. Pray always, regularly, in the place of solitude. Pray always in communal worship. Pray, or at least be with the company of believers who are praying even when somehow I cannot. Pray when it seems about as meaningful as saying your ABCs. Pray always. Pray unabashedly. When I used to walk those Tenderloin streets in collar and cross, so many people reached out, please stop, pray for me. Pray for me right now, right here, with cars and pedestrians going by. And let us each ask ourselves, when was the last time I asked someone to pray for me or offered to pray for them? You don't have to have a title in front of your name to do that. Pray to be a peacemaker, a healer. Pray when you watch the TV news or read the paper. Pray when you wake up in the dead of the night. Pray always, and do not lose heart. Do not lose heart. Norma Hotaling is an example of an importunate woman. When I met Norma, she had just established a small daytime drop-in center for homeless, drug-addicted, prostituted women. And Network Ministries was right on the verge of founding the Safe House for women escaping prostitution, a residential place for women to come off of the streets and to live and heal and change their lives. And so, of course, we consulted Norma. Norma had once been on those streets dating back to her early teens, and she told us it took her 26 tries to transform her life. 26 tries. She kept at it. Don't judge. Ask yourself, when was the last time I vowed to lose 5 pounds and keep it off? Or to undertake some physical or intellectual or spiritual discipline and never falter? I'm going to put a book in the library, and if you want to understand something of the power of addiction, read this book, Generation X. It really is about the incredible growing problem we have today of people who become addicted to prescription drugs. Norma went on to enlarge that center, calling it SAGE, Standing Against Global Exploitation. And this woman who had once walked the streets began to travel the world in an effort to bring to consciousness and to combat sex trafficking and slavery. Cancer claimed her life, but her legacy lives on among those like Safe House, seeking justice for God's exploited daughters and sons, so that everyone might grow into the fullness of God's image as God intended from their birth. Such a woman came to Safe House, having been trafficked. She came from another city. She had been abducted as a preteen, and she was held for years as a sex slave before being dumped on the streets because she was no longer young enough to be desirable. She is about 6 feet tall. At Safe House, I'll come back to that. At Safe House, she discovered more and more her inner strength and beauty, and she renewed her childhood faith in Jesus. She is about 6 feet tall, or at least she looks that way to me, but most people over 12 look really high to me. She's an African-American trans woman. She is a fundamentalist Christian, believing in the literal interpretation of the Bible. When I was asked to help her find a church where she would be truly and fully accepted and affirmed, I scratched my head trying to put together all of those elements. And she persisted, and she found such a church. And she is continuing to try to get the needed education for becoming a minister to at-risk youth and an advocate for them, an importunate woman of deep faith and prayer. One final inspiring story, and I do tell these stories to inspire you. These are about ordinary people who have done and are doing extraordinary things. After John Kennedy was assassinated and Lyndon Johnson became president, a group of civil rights leaders met with Johnson. They demanded his leadership in passing the Voting Rights Act. And Johnson told them, "You're right, but this will be a battle. I need you to create an atmosphere that will force me to push this, and I will sign this legislation." They did that, but not alone. Thousands of people persisted in the pursuit of justice. And then there came that awful, bloody confrontation on the Selma Bridge, and the legislation was passed and signed. A young John Lewis was in the forefront of that march on that bridge. He suffered a fractured skull, and he laid for 2 weeks in a coma, not expected to live. Today, still with a steel plate in his head, he is a congressman from the state of Georgia. This past June, following that massacre in a gay nightclub in Orlando, John Lewis led a sit-in. I love this man. He led a sit-in on the floor of Congress, bringing 40 members of Congress to protest Congress's failure to pass legislation intended to reduce gun violence. This man of deep faith, some 53 years after his near death, prayerfully persists in the pursuit of justice. And time does not allow to tell again the story of Donaldina Cameron, but probably you know her, for whom Cameron House is named. If you don't, look her up. An importunate woman of faith who barged into places with where there were women, young Chinese women who were held in servitude, as sex slaves or domestic workers or in factories. She didn't go alone. She found a police officer who shared her compassion and her commitment to the persistent pursuit of justice. So finally, in the 1970s, Malvina Reynolds, y'all remember Malvina Reynolds? Some of you weren't born then, but some of people may remember her. She wrote and sang this song. God bless the grass that grows through the crack. They roll the concrete over it and try to keep it back. The concrete gets tired of what it has to do. It breaks and it buckles and the grass grows through. God bless the grass. Pray always and do not lose heart.